Okay. My name's Tom Gorman. I'm a senior lecturer in theatre here at Coventry University. This project, which we've called Coriolanus Online, began as a very different beast. It began as an oil project, which is an online international learning project. And I got the opportunity to travel to Tampere in Finland to talk to Tina, who a colleague had met at a conference a year ago. And Tina is very much, she's a voice teacher, an actor trainer, and an expert in acting in a foreign language. And so she'd done a lot of work in China, in Italy, in various other places across the world. And her research has been into what happens to an actor when they have to do a play in another language that they don't necessarily speak and they won't have time to learn that language. And so I went over to Tampere not really knowing what to expect, and flew over. It's a really long flight and a really long train journey, and met with Tina, picked me up outside the hotel, took me for a drive through Tampere, and we went to the university and spent a very, very long day drinking coffee and eating really, really nice cakes, discussing what it was we could do. And my thought is, what do we bring to this, since they have very much this expertise in acting in a foreign language? What can we bring to the table? And so all the way over, I had been thinking, what's our skills? And I thought of the Warwickshire connection was very much, I mean, we're 20 miles down the road from Stratford, which is Shakespeare's birthplace. I have a great passion for Shakespeare. Part of my PhD has been in Renaissance theatre. And I really much, I enjoy personally, as when I was an actor, I really enjoyed doing Shakespeare, and I've enjoyed directing Shakespeare, and I have some level of expertise in working with Shakespearean text. And I threw very casually into the conversation at one point the idea of possibly we look at Shakespeare. And I didn't know that I'd kind of hit a button there, that they, again, were very interested in Shakespeare themselves because of the cultural differences and the way they receive Shakespeare, which is either something they go to see performed by English or American companies, obviously in English, or they would maybe do in translation. But Miko and Tina, Miko, who I also met that day, it turns out were passionate Shakespeare nuts. Miko had spent a year over in England as well, and had worked, done some training with the RSC, had worked with Brian Cox, and we just kind of hit it off over a mutual love of Shakespeare, and that's the genesis of the project. Began as kind of exploring the idea of acting in a foreign language, but then it slowly began to change into what the project is now. And as we were exploring how we were going to do it, Skype initially was one of the ideas, FaceTime, and I did a lot of work with various different people about, well, how do we do this? And I met with a guy called Tom Cochrane, who's a technologist who comes from New Zealand, and he gave me some very solid advice, which I then completely ignored. But he'd done a lot of work, and he didn't feel we could do synchronized teaching. He felt that because of the limitations of the technology, that we would have to go asynchronous, that it would have to be very much, we would do something and we demonstrate it to the Finnish side, and then they would work on that and they would present it back to us. But he didn't feel we could achieve synchronization. You were wrong, Tom. But he was actually really useful in terms of the other aspect of it, which is the idea of putting the technology into the hands of students, in that he had been using things like Google Hangouts. And this was an idea that eventually we developed, the idea of using Adobe Connect, and we had a series of rooms in Adobe Connect. We had 7 groups of students working on Act 3, Scene 3 from Coriolanus. And we had a main room where we gave lectures on both sides. I did 2 lectures on kind of Renaissance theatre and Shakespeare and Coriolanus. Tina did a lecture on acting in a foreign language, and Hannah from their English department did a really interesting lecture as well on Finnish theatre, which we know very little about, and the history of Finnish theatre, and also Finnish culture and Finnish history to kind of place Finnish theatre in context for us. And we had these other 6 rooms where each group could go and rehearse. So when they weren't working with us in the main space, they were off in Adobe Connect, working on the scenes together. There were 2 Finnish students on one side and 3 on our side in each group. And they would work on lines, and then they'd bring it and present it to the main space. And the tutors could drop in and out and help as well. So Tina especially did a lot of work in those rooms with our students when our students were dealing with the Finnish text. So we worked on the scene in both Finnish and English. And they're very different scenes in both. The Finnish scene, as we discovered, isn't in blank verse. The English scene, of course, is in blank verse, which has a certain metre because it's Shakespeare. And the interesting thing is how, when you switch from one language to another, what it does to the scene, which is very much Tina's research. And so eventually, when we met again in December and Joff showed us Extract Insert, his work, which is very much using avatars and digital puppets, we began to kind of have these crazy thoughts about what about using real people instead of puppets? What if we could take that idea and using video conferencing equipment that we'd already been talking about using but on a much smaller scale, what if we took that and blew it up to a much larger scale? And then of course the whole idea was to give the illusion that we were sharing the same space, to light both spaces sympathetically so that the students had the illusion that there was just a window separating them, that there was, that we were essentially in the same room. That worked out differently than we thought. I mean, it was one of those things that every day something very different was happening. Every day we were learning something. We've just chatted this morning again, and one of the things we said was that we really felt we were only getting to grips with it by the very last day. That we really were only discovering what it could do by the end of the 2-week session.
How is this different from using just Skype?
Well, one of the differences is in image quality, and the size by which we were able to go. So we were going straight through the video conferencing software and the video conferencing, the Polycom unit. And one of the limitations of that, we think, is it's designed for boardrooms. So one of the things we'd like to explore in the future is a wider angle camera. However, the limitation with it at the minute is it's one basic piece of kit. So if you take the camera out, it won't work. Myself and John discovered at one point, and this is admitting our stupidity, that it was the camera that actually turned on the unit, because we spent several hours pointing the remote control at the wrong bit of kit and thinking the video conferencing unit was broken, until we actually discovered that no, we were basically trying to turn on a television by pointing a remote at a fridge and wondering why it wasn't working. But then we figured out that yeah, the camera is the thing that makes the whole unit work. So if you take the camera away, the video conferencing unit doesn't work. And it does have quite a narrow field of vision. I mean, we were using Academy aspect ratio screens, so we were using 4:3, and it would be very nice to go wider. And then we could have more students and we could have more space to explore. The video conferencing unit also has software in it which eliminates a lot of the feedback. When I talk and my voice comes out at the other end, they obviously need to hear me to hear what I'm saying, but also we end up in a feedback loop. As anyone who's tried to do a Skype call with multiple people has discovered, you end up in a feedback loop, so you have to put headphones in to eliminate, because you'll also hear yourself coming back. So because of the lag, you'll hear your own voice at the other end, and they'll hear their own voices at the other end coming out of your speakers. So this loop will create, and it's just this Doppler effect will happen. And obviously you don't want actors walking around with headphones on, so the video conferencing thing has some fancy software which cuts that down a bit. But also it means that we can use protocols and we can get a much faster speed than Skype And so we had it down to milliseconds at its best moments. And you can kind of see this in some of the footage we have, where it is almost instantaneous, where there is literally a millisecond difference. And that's really good for actors, because actors need to be able to react quickly, they need to be able to cue off each other quickly. And especially the nature of the scene we were doing, which is an argument, which is fast, it needs to be fast paced, because it is an argumentative scene in which characters are interrupting each other. I mean, at one point one character says, "If I could speak that," and is immediately interrupted by the other actor. So you can't have a situation where the actor says, "If I could speak that, what?" It's not going to work as a scene. So that's one of the things that the Polycom, we used a Polycom at our side, they used a Tandberg at their side, but they both spoke the same language. Skype, some of the students used Skype. We had problems with Adobe Connect. The week that we were using it, Adobe decided to update some of their software, which threw one of the main rooms into chaos. But the students solved that themselves. The students went immediately to Skype themselves to continue the work. So the students did take the technology into their own hands. And as Miko mentioned earlier, one of the great things about the whole project, and it seems so unimportant, but it's the one thing that we love, is on the last night, the students went drinking on Adobe Connect. So there's a lovely little picture on our Facebook group of some guys in a bar in Finland, and some guys in a bar in Coventry, and somebody in their room in Coventry, all sharing a virtual beer together.